All right. So this week we're going to learn how to create a simple home security dashboard. Of course, you can think of a variety of different things you can do with the dashboard. But for our purposes, we will basically put together a couple of things that we've already learned and try to integrate a couple of pieces and use them um, in a application that is going to demonstrate the usage of those things together. And I've been thinking about how to do this, and I've decided to actually going to use a little bit of JavaScript because the real world application, when you want to develop a UI, and most likely you're going to use a little bit of JavaScript. So I think that's a little more suitable than the using all Python because we're learning Python. So I'm going to try to my best to explain. It's not that complicated. Now, first things we want to do is to actually design the UI. So we have kind of a rough idea of what we're trying to accomplish. And so over here, you're seeing my little very rough design. This is a mock-up. The real world UI design is a little bit more involved. And there are many different tools to do the design, and then you will need to learn the tool to use that properly. You can get the mock-ups very accurate to the level where you eventually want to see what the UI is going to look like. And of course, you will have to show the variations of the UI when the user interacts with it. So like toggling a button and some pop-up shows up, right? There's all the different flows will need to be basically rendered in the UI. Now, that is not our focus. So we're going to try to simplify the parts that are not our focus. So instead, I drew this rough mock-up, essentially manually, and it gave us an idea of what we're trying to accomplish, but the actual eventual UI will be somewhat a little different depending on the UI framework we're going to use. I'll get to that in a moment. And then you'll see this is going to have a couple of the things. The first function that we want to have is to be able to arm or disarm the system. And when the system is disarmed, it will not alert. It will basically ignore whatever is happening. Like, for example, when you're home, you want to disarm your system, right? So when it's armed, then it will pay attention. It will trigger alerts, whatever you're trying to accomplish with your system. So that is the first thing. We want to have a control here. The idea behind this is we're going to use the button and also LED as a status indicator for the physical circuit. And then we'll actually control, you can physically control to turn the system on and off with that button, and or you can control this from the UI and by clicking this more like a toggle switch. So that gives you an idea. And then we have a few other cards. So in terms of the UI terminology, this is called a card. It has some information here. This information is going to be about tempering. And tempering, well, in our case, what we're going to do probably is to see if the device has been moved. We're going to leverage the sense hat. It has a couple of sensors that can detect motion. And we're going to see if, let's say your device is actually enclosed in some kind of box, and that's maybe affixed on a surface or somewhere. And then if somebody trying to tamper it, and then so they move it, or there's going to be some kind of vibration. So that's what this box is going to show. And then this alarm status is actually going to show, we're going to actually use a buzzer. So when we need to alarm, actually we'll physically ring that buzzer, make that high-pitched noise. It could scare the intruder off, right? Just for for fun. And so this box, well, basically this card will show that alarm status. Probably will have some kind of icon here when is alarming or not alarming. And then we're also going to have another card that will show the motion, whether there's a motion detected. Not only detect the motion, we also probably will, and we'll also show the distance of that object. And we're going to use a motion distance sensor. So we have learned all these different devices that we can use here. And so we're going to put the couple of things together into this dashboard. Okay. And the dashboard is basically it's going to be a web app. All right. So that's the idea. Now, what I like to do in this lecture first, well, let's try to accomplish this part, get this control working to turn the system on and off. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the service side first. Now, I call this service HSD service, just, abbreviate the name, Home Security Dashboard. Now, HSD service. Now here, we are not using a database. We're simply going to just have this service be the bridge between the physical circuit and the UI, which will be running in a browser. And the service is a Flask app. And so we have already used a Flask a couple of times. And so this is not going to be strange to you. So we'll have actually a couple of API routes that we'll actually implement here. So let me kind of go through this little bit. So I actually have tried to componentize the application, just kind of have a couple of different files that will handle different things to, as separate modules. Just make the program a little bit easier to understand is this organization of the code instead of having everything in a single file, which is really not how you program in the real world. Unless your program is a super simple, is a hello world type application, then fine, right? But if you're doing a little bit of some meaningful, sophisticated things, and then you want to have things into separate modules, and this goes to the design for both the service and the UI part, is just a code organization for a better understanding of the code. Now, so here we're going to also first we're going to create this app object, which is the Flask object, and you'll notice we're using a course here. Now, course stands for cross or region request. Cross or region, I kind of already can't figure out the request specification, I think. So anyway, what this is about is it's a security feature the browser will enforce if the service can impose certain kind of restrictions on how the service can be used on the UI. And so basically this is a security feature. What we're doing here is we're going to enable CORS so that your browser will run normally because this is the policy we're going to set on the server side. So you don't need to worry too much about this here. We're just using the simplest case. This will apply a couple of default settings to the Flask app. And so the application will run, without any problem from the browser. So anyway, because the browsers are going to look at you because the domain we're going to be running from is a local domain, and it's gonna potentially gonna complain about it. Okay, and now we'll create an object of the announcer. What is announcer? So the idea here, and let me open up this file. Announcer. This is a separate module which has a class. Now this is this is a module that handles the server-side events. So if you recall that I introduced a couple weeks ago about the way the front end and back end could communicate in a streaming ways, in a way that allows the server, to send. So, the typical HTTP REST API is the client needs to request from a service, and then the service will respond. Now, what if it happens in this case? Because let's say I push a button to turn the system on and off, we need to have that information reflected back to the UI. So we need to send an event from the server to the client. Okay, so that's what this is about. And this particular class here is essentially doing this communication here. Now, as you also know, perhaps at least you heard about, there's another technology. It's called WebSocket. And that WebSocket is more of a protocol that's suitable for, let's say, a chat application. You have, client and server doing, you know, communication back and forth, and both sides can initiate a message. Now, in the case of here, I want to simplify. I don't want to use the WebSocket here. So instead, I use a simple server-side event. The server-side event, what we're doing here is, so first this encapsulates the functionality where we basically gather the listeners to the messages. And the listeners, each listener will have a message queue. So we're using the queue structure here. This is from Python, a standard queue. Each listener will have a message queue. And when we announce a message, what we're doing here is we announce the message to everybody that's listening to, everybody that's listening to the event, basically. So this is a basic thing. Now this server-side event has a particular format, and this is for formatting the messages textual based. And the event can have a event name followed by a message, or you can omit the event as well. But in our case, we're going to actually use the event. That's how you categorize different types of messages, so to speak. And let's say in this case, we're going to have a status message, which will show is it armed or is it, unarmed, basically. That's the status message. All right, so this is what this is about. And here, so we'll create a announcer object. And then we're going to create another object as the arm switch. Now, so the arm switch is the combination of the LED and the button. So you already know how to connect these two devices into your breadboard. And so what we're doing here is if the LED is on, that means the system is armed. If the LED is off, the system is disarmed. Okay. And then this button, what we're doing here is a momentary button, so we can, what we'll do is we're going to just toggle the LED on and off. So essentially that's what so that allows us to physically turn the system on and off, or arm the system or disarm the system by the push of a button. So first, we'll create this LED in a button object, and the button will have this when released. So when you push down, there's an event handler if you want to, but we want one push and a release action. We're going to handle that toggling event. So we're essentially we're going to create a function here, which first does the toggle the LED, and that's on the physical circuit. But then this particular change needs to be communicated back. How do we communicate it back? All the way back to UI. So I'm going to explain this part. To communicate that back, we're going to actually take a callback function. Okay, the callback function is going to handle the necessary message sending back to the UI, to the client. And we're going to pass the value here. The value is the LED on and off, which is equivalent to whether the security system is armed or disarmed. Okay. And then we're also going to have a property here. This is something I try to use a bit of new things just to help you learn. You don't have to use this, but this is sort of a more of a common way. So this is essentially the getter. You can get the value of armed. It's equivalent to if you just do the create a regular method. But anyway, so this is a property which is essentially whether this is armed or not when it's use this is active property of LED object. And then with this property, then we can define a setter with a decorator here. And the setter is that it's going to take a value, and then we're going to set that value back to LED. Okay. So that's this is the arm switch. Okay, I call this the arm switch, arming or disarming, switching this status. So this is the this particular module here. So we're going to create a arm switch, and I will use this is the pin for LED, a pin for the button, and then the callback. Now the callback, you can use a regular function as I mentioned before, or use if it's a simple expression, then you can use a lambda. And the lambda in Python is really kind of limited. So you create a lambda with a simple expression here. So we take a value. So recall this callback actually takes a Boolean value as an argument and then returns nothing. So actually all we're doing here is we're going to announce this event. And the way we're going to do this event content is we're going to send a JSON, turn this JSON into a string with its JSON.dump s is to turn this dictionary into a JSON string. Okay. So we say armed, and then this is the value, whether it's true or false. And the type of the event is called status. Okay. Now, so if we're going to push that button, it's going to call this, it's going to announce, it will send an event to the announcer. Well, the announcer is going to announce the event. Once it announces the event, and the other part of this is that we're going to listen. We're going to actually register listener on the messages. Okay. So the way of communication is you have someone that sends a message, then you have someone else that receives the message, okay, which is the listener. So we're going to have an API endpoint, call it /listen. And this is what the UI is going to use to establish a connection. It's going to be always connected. And then and the server will be able to send the event through this channel. So over here, all we're doing is we define a generator function. So it's called a generator. So this is a little bit more advanced feature of Python. So You don't need to understand exactly, but I will try to explain this. What a generator function does is every time you call the function, it can pause, remember the state. And then when you call it again, it will continue from where it left off. That's so it's kind of a little bit of magic, but really it's actually fairly easy to understand. So for what we're doing here is that this function is going to run, uh, all the time. It will not stop. You can keep running it basically. What this do is first we're going to actually call the listen method. This is going to be registering um, this listen. If you take a look at that again, this will basically register um, a new queue into the message announcer, and then that becomes a listener. The listener has a message queue, and that queue will be returned back, which is, we'll call this messages. And then we're going to have a while true loop, forever loop. And over here, we'll call this get method. This get method is basically on the queue. This will basically block until there's a new message comes into the queue. If the queue is empty, it's going to just block until it has a message. If there's already a message, then it will return that message. And so we'll basically then we'll yield the message. This function on this particular call will return the message. Okay. Now, and then because this is the Flask API endpoint, what we're doing here is we're going to return a response. This response, we're going to wrap this function for streaming, and actually we'll give a specific type of the return response. It's called a MIME type, and the type name it's basically here. This is a special type. It's called text/event-stream. So this event stream, this is really what makes this API considered as a server-sending event API. Okay, so that's what we're going to be using here to listen to the server for the events. Now, the other thing here is that we're also going to have a regular API endpoint that's going to first, there's this slash status is going to get the status. And over here, we're going to get the status from this arm switch, the dot armed property. This will get the current status, okay? And then we'll also want to be able to update the status from the web. So we're going to use this patch method. This is similar to what you've learned about the LED service, remember a couple weeks back? So again, we're going to update the service. The client is going to send a JSON body to the service that will say, armed, on and off. When we'll click on that toggle switch on the UI. And so if it actually has this armed property in that JSON body, then we're going to do is we're going to actually change the value of this armed property of arm switch to whatever that value that was passed in. Okay. So this is it. This is the service for what we need to do right now. And this, you need to run this service on the Pi. So you run this on the Pi because obviously we have this physical circuit. We're connecting to the LED and button. Okay. What else I need to explain here? The other thing that is a little bit new here, I'm using this logging library instead of the, excuse me, just print. I say logging and I have a basic configuration. Say I want to log at the debug level, and I have some login messages there, like a login.debug. So you can adjust the debug level, the login level to decide to show or not show this particular message when it will print out from when you run the application. This is a little minor things here, and really when you write a real world application, you do want to use the logging messages, not just to do the print. So because then you have a control to see what level of login messages you want. And anyway, that's that. So this is the service part. Let's take a look at the UI. And the UI, first, let's take a look at, this is just a basic, JavaScript application with HTML. So if you're not very familiar with this, hopefully you will follow along. And, this is, I try to make this as simple as possible and use simple libraries that make this what we need to do fairly straightforward. Now, if you're making a little more sizable application that has a lot of things, then there's obviously a different type of setup using perhaps even different kinds of frameworks to develop your application. But for our purposes, I try to make it as simple as possible. Okay, so this is what I have here. So this is a HTML file here. Inside this HTML, you see these tags, right? So this is really general format. This is uh, this doc type is declaration is saying this HTML, and this is going to run in the browser. The browser will interpret this. The browser runs this and interprets whatever code is in here. Okay, this is an instruction for the browser to display the UI. And this is really mostly what the website is about. If you look at the many of the websites on the internet, so it will always have some HTML. This is the technology for web. Okay, so now this is saying this is going to use HTML5, which is the newer standard of HTML, and this is really what the modern web applications typically will use. And this HTML tag is the root tag, and a language property says this is for English. And it has a header. That's where we're going to specify a couple of metadata and also some linkages. So the metadata here, for example, this is going to actually make this page look nice even on a mobile device. Now, well, in our case, we're not going to consider too much about making the page looking fine on all kinds of devices, but that is a concern if you're developing a real world application. But in our case, we're going to just make sure it looks okay on a desktop browser. Okay. And we're going to also kind of leverage the existing UI components that's already there. So we're going to try to minimize our work. So here, for example, we're using some icons and the fonts from a particular location that will be downloaded by the browser. And then we're also using this thing called a view material, which is a UI library that has the different components already made ready to use. So we'll simplify our work. And then the primary this two actually, one is for this tool. We're gonna this three things basically is the standard libraries that the resources, not library, they're the style sheet resources that we're gonna want to load into our UI. This is about the view material. And we're also gonna have our own style sheet that will customize the UI a little bit. And then in the body here, we have a structure of our our page, basically. And so we'll have a div, which essentially is a container. And then over here, we have a title. I call this Home Security Dashboard. And then here we actually add a thing called the ARM switch. Now, you'll notice I use the same name as the backend. You'll see what this is about. So this is a component on the UI that corresponds to the backend. And so we'll have this showing up on the UI and allow us to control, to arm or disarm the system. And we'll have a bunch of scripts that we're loading up. So the primary library we're using here to accomplish this UI application is a Vue.js. Some of you may be familiar with this, but if you're not, don't worry about try to learn everything about it. I'll explain enough for you to understand. And then also the Vue material about the UI components also has a JavaScript portion of this, not just the style sheets and stuff, because this is the code that will give us the components that we need to use in Vue. Now, then we'll have another library called Axios. Axios is a library for making HTTP calls. And then we're also going to have our own component JavaScript is the ARM switch. That's the code for this component ARM switch. Okay, the reason that you see this tag here, ARM switch, this is a custom component. This is not a standard HTML, but this will be handled by this component. Okay, armswitch.js. And then we'll have some embedded script here, and then you could move this into a different file, but I decided to put this in here. This is the top level that JavaScript is going to run initially when you load the page. So here, first, we're going to load up the Vue material. So this is a kind of a middleware for the Vue library. So it will load up the Vue material objects into Vue, so we can access those things in there. And then, so this is the, now, of course, in your case, you will need to change this host name. This is our, what you want to use is the host name of your Pi. That's where the service is running. The UI is going to, communicate with that, right? Communicate with the API running on the Pi. Then we're going to add this service URL actually as a constant into this object. So you see things like this, in Python, this would be looking like a dictionary, but in JavaScript, this is, an object. Okay, this is what JSON is about. This is what JSON comes from. JSON is coming from JavaScript language. This is really a JSON. In JavaScript, this makes an object. But you use it just like a dictionary. There's really no practical difference. And then we are creating, so remember the way we want to establish a connection to the server side, so the server can actually notify the UI if the system is armed or unarmed by pushing that button, right? So that communication to the client is through this server-side event. So we'll call this SSAE, and using this, this is the web API that's provided by the browser. Okay, this is all standardized. The reason that's why we can use this. So it's called the event source. And then remember that /listen, that's the API that we made on the server side, right? So we're going to have this SSE as an event source, that's basically the server-side event client. The UI is going to use this object to communicate with the backend. We'll get to that. Now, then we're going to make an object called app. This is the primary object that we're going to interact with. This app is the Vue app. So this is the Vue library. As I mentioned, this is the primary library we use to build this application here. And the Vue library, we're going to pass a JSON here, this object. So instead of saying JSON, when we're talking about in JavaScript, we're going to say this is an object. In this object, we'll have a property called methods. This is a bunch of methods that we're going to use in different places. So here we define a method here. This is actually a event handler for the server-side event messages. So if the server sends a message over to the UI, this is where we're going to handle it and print out a debug message with a console.log. This is just like the logging library on the back end, okay, in Python. So this is for logging. This will not be displayed to the user. This will be only shown on the console when you use the debugging tool in the browser. Okay. All right. Now, so we're going to receive this message from the server side. Remember, we're going to pass a JSON all the way through this API. And the JSON, we need to parse that JSON back to an object. It's because that JSON is a string, right? It's in the message.data. It's a JSON string. So we need to parse that back into an object so we can get this armed property out of that JSON. So that's what we need to get out of it. And then once we get this value here, and then we're going to actually change, communicate with that component here, this arm switch, created a ref property so that we can reference it. So that's how we can reference it. We use this.refs.arm switch. This is the name for this ref. And then dot change armed. Now this change armed is a method that's defined on that component. We're going to look at that in a second. Actually, let's take a look at that right now. So this is this arm switch is a view component. And so the way to make a view component is using the view.component here, give it a name. This name is we're going to use here as the tag name here, arm switch. And then followed by a object. In this object, first we actually have a template. And this template is what's going to be rendered and then inserted back to here. This will be eventually replaced with a regular HTML tags because, the browser will not recognize what this is, right? So this will be actually rendered back to this standard, tags that, HTML standard, so that div. As you notice, this actually uses another custom component, a component, which is a view component. Now, this view component comes from the view material library. So remember I said we want to use a third-party UI library. So we don't have to code too much. We're going to use that. So MD switch is actually from the view material library, okay? And so if you actually want to see what it looks like, view material. So the view material defines many components you can use in your view application. So for example, the one we're using here, this is called a switch. So this is what we're using. You see this style here. We're going to actually make a switch. This is the style that we're going to use actually. And, to make this work, you need some CSS, some JavaScript, some HTML. So this all encapsulated nicely into a component we can reuse instead of making our own, which will be a lot of work. Okay, we don't need to focus on that. So you'll notice there's now I'll get back to this a little bit. So here, except then we have the template that defines the structure of the page or that piece of the page, right? So we see that and this kind of lays out how we're going to approach this. So we're going to have other things as well later as we finish the UI, right? So this is the first thing we want to do. This is a considered component. And then we also have a data property. The data property is actually a function here. And this function is it returns a object which has an armed property. Now, this armed property allows us to do is allows the two-way communication between the data model and the UI. So this is what the V model property here is for, is that whenever this switch, you see that switch, on and off, this on and off has a state. This state is synchronized with this UI changes right here, right? So the synchronization we're going to use by using this property called armed. And I also have a bunch of methods. This is where we define this change armed method here, that which we're using right here for when we push that button and the server send an event back to the UI. And the event says now armed, true or false, right? So we're going to call this method here, and then we're going to basically change armed. Hold on a second. So we could potentially, we could actually potentially improve this a little bit. The reason that I reuse the same method here, because this is what we're going to use to handle the change event. So when you click on this, this will trigger, the browser will trigger a change event. And the change event, you use this add symbol. That's called the event handler. This, and then we're going to call this change armed. And so this can be improved because right here, if we're triggering from this UI and click on here, and this will actually, what this will do is it will trigger this event. It will call this method, and because we now want to change the physical circuit, so we're going to actually call the API/status. We'll do the patch. Remember that patch method on the service, and then we'll pass this as JSON. We'll say, armed true or false. Okay. So this is we're sending this back to the server. Now, if it comes from the message back from the server to the client, and I'm reusing the same here because I'm using this effect to actually change the status, the armed value. So in fact, this is actually this actually can be changed actually in a better way. This is let me actually improve this. It does not need to call the backend API again because this comes from the server side. This is from the UI, the client to the server. This is back from the server to the client. So essentially, really, this is what needs to be done here. So I just noticed this can be improved, although it did work before. So we're going to do it this way, okay? And we'll test this out to see if it works. And then we also have another, it's called a hook. This hook is basically saying if we're going to, when the browser destroys, and maybe we quit the tab or closed it. And then when we close this, destroy the object of view, we want to actually close, actually, this is a typo here. We want to close the server-side event object to basically serve the connection with the server, okay? So that's what we want to do here before to destroy the view. We want to close that connection, the event source. And then we also want to call it app.mount. This is just simply a method. And the app.mount and pass in the an expression here. This is saying find the element in the HTML that has an ID called app. Essentially, this div element. So it will mount the application. This object will be associated with this particular div. Okay, this is basically where it's going to operate. And then with the server-side event, we're not done yet. We need to register event listener. Okay, we need to listen to the server-side event, and we're gonna say, well, the event type is a status, and then we're gonna have a handler, and this handler is this method we define right here. Okay. And back to arm switch. Now, arm switch has one more thing here that I did not explain here, is this mounted. hook. This is saying when we load this portion, this component, when it's loaded, when we render it, it's going to actually initialize, the armed property, initialize it with the value coming from the server side. It will reflect if right now system is armed or not armed based on the LED status, right? So we'll use this service, the status API to do a get, and we'll get the value, and then we'll set this value into this armed property, which is, bound to this switch. So they will change the switch to whatever value that's from the server side. Okay. And here, this switch, what we're doing here is we're going to change that word depending on this, armed or unarmed. We're going to say armed or unarmed. Okay. And that's it. That's basically this is basically this component. Now, the CSS, we just have two rules here. One rule is saying, well, one, align everything to the center of the screen. This actually is similar to how when we initialize the app object, if you recall, we pass this hash app. This is actually the same rule mechanism as the CSS to find the div element. That's right here with the ID app. Okay, and then we're going to customize saying, well, everything inside of that container, we want this to be aligned to the center. These are the specific properties of the rule. Now, the other thing we're also doing here is we want to increase the size from the material view. The view material library is kind of small. So we're increasing the size of that text about armed or unarmed, which is in the label. And this is the class that's defined on that element, the container, the arm switch container. And this is going to be replaced with, one of those elements is going to be a label. So this is what we're doing here. Okay. And again, if you don't understand too much about CSS, don't worry about this, and you will not be asked to do any CSS work. Okay. And so this is, if you already understand or you want to learn more, that you can learn more on your own. But this is as simple as it can get. So I'm trying to simplify and make this as easy as possible. But the functionality we need to implement does require quite a little bit of code, as much as I can gather the minimum amount of code for you to get this going. And then really to run this is a very straightforward. You just, I have, just copy the path and open this in a browser, and I would have this open, I use a Firefox. So see, when you load up, it's like this. Okay. Now, of course, when you're developing your app, you want to right click and then say inspect. Okay. And then click on console. We're going to look at the console output. So you actually notice we already output something, fetching status as an example. Fetching status is from here, right here, because it rendered that component. This is the component. And right now it says unarmed. And actually, if you look at the physical circuit, right, the LED is off. So it's unarmed. Okay. So now back to this. Now let's test this. Well, two ways to test this. First, I want to use this to turn the LED on and off, basically, and to say let's try to arm the system and see if the LED will light on. Okay, so I turn this on. The UI says on, right, and then the LED is also on. Okay, and how did this work? This worked because it is sent. It called the API. It called the API here to, we made a change to that value. We actually do a patch, use this API, and the service is handling that change. You remember the server side. You can go back to the server side, the HSD service, and the way that's handled here, right? So essentially, we are changing that arm switch to armed to that value, okay? Now, of course, we'll continue to off again. So let me turn this off. And now you see LED is off, okay? Now let's test from the other side. Let's manually turn the system on off with a button and let's see if the UI is reflecting that at all, okay? So let me push that button so you will see the LED on and then we'll look at the UI also, okay? Let's take a look. All right, so LED is on and let's take a look at the browser. Actually, let me see. So it did not work. It did not work. And let's actually take a look. We did make a change and I thought that was an improvement. Let's take a look. So we set this armed to that value. Maybe I should kind of reload this thing. Let me take a look. Hold on. Let me turn that off. Okay, what was happening is the code, the browser, sometimes when you make changes, the browser actually caches the old files. So I had to reload it. And so that now it works. Now that's okay, so now it's off. Now let me turn it on and then we'll look at the browser. Okay, so LED is on. Let me share the screen. Back to the browser. You see this is on. And then actually look at debug messages here. So got the message armed true. This is what we printed out in the code here. So we know that's happening. So we got the message right here. This is what's printed out. And then we change it to ARM status. Change it ARM property on the ARM switch component. Now, of course, it goes, back to this way. We can turn this off and that continue to work, right? It will turn off the LED. And then now if I turn on the LED again, just show it one more time. Okay, so that's on. Let's take a look at the UI that's on. And then let me click the button to turn that off. Okay, let's take a look at the UI again. Now that's off, right? You see this message printed out, the debug messages. So that's it, right? It seems a simple, it's called a toggle switch here. This is kind of the thing that the style that you may be familiar with on an Android. That's why it's called Material. The Material UI is inspired by Google. This is kind of the UI design language that they try to use in, across different devices in their products. So this is how, even though the UI is not that much, there's quite a bit of code behind to make that work. We've connected this UI control here to our physical circuit, and we can control both ways from the UI or from the circuit. They are connected. They are synchronized. Okay, so that's it for this lecture.